Thank you. I'm Saskia Epstein. I am all the time Chief Operating Officer, sometimes CEO, chef, current college advisor, and I'm going to add to my list social media screen time data analyst. I'm a working mother. In my day job, I am the Senior Vice President of PNC Bank here in New England, and I lead external affairs, which means that I get to work with the fabulous team at the Boston Globe on convenings and connection and learning opportunities such as this. And I lead our philanthropy. And today I am very, very excited that we are pulling together a lot of the threads in our lives, in my personal life and professionally. At PNC, as a bank, we care a lot about ROI. We care a lot about economic opportunity and prosperity for all. And as displayed from the conversations we've had and will have, working mothers are running the city. They are leading families and leading the development of entrepreneurship and childcare system reform and the overall social context and social impact that will benefit our children for generations to come. I have the privilege of working with Linda Henry on the Massachusetts Business Coalition for Early Childhood, which Linda co-chairs with our regional president, John Bernstein. And that coalition has 80 companies representing 300,000 employees throughout the state of Massachusetts who are really advocating for childcare. It is one of PNC's core philanthropic priorities because we know that early childcare investments lead to greater economic opportunity for companies, for businesses, and also for families. And I'm very excited that we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into things that we care about, like childcare, with our guest today, Lauren Kennedy, who is the co-founder of Neighborhood Villages. We also have Donna Levin, who has deep expertise both in childcare as a co-founder of Care.com, which some of you may be familiar with, and spearheading the study of entrepreneurship at Babson College. And we are in expert hands with Janelle Nanos. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so pleased to be the presenting sponsor and to do some deep learning and reflection with you.
Thank you so much, Saskia, and to PNC for having us here today and hosting us. Thank you to all of you for being here. Like we said, this is the hottest ticket in town today. We've got so many people who are Zooming in. I want to just encourage you all, if you have questions, you can either type them in if you're on Zoom, or you can just scan the QR code on your little badge, and I'll see them here. But before we get started on the questions, I'm going to give you some math. So how many of you have heard of girl math? Okay, we're going to do a quick bit of mom math. First off, I'm sure all of you know, because you live in Massachusetts, we are one of the most highest in terms of cost in the country. The cost of living is among the highest. Our childcare costs are also #1 in the nation. On average, it costs $24,000 a year to have an infant in daycare these days. For a married couple, that is 14.4% of their income. For a single parent, it is 56% of their income. So that's there. That's the first five years or so. From there, the costs just keep growing. So I want to do a quick round of hands here. Who in the room is currently attempting to cover the cost of daycare? Great. Who is trying to figure out whether to stay in the workforce or pull back from their career? Okay. Who is attempting to do the math on if they're going to pay for a child to go to school or college? Okay. Who is taking on additional expenses as a caregiver for a parent or family member? Okay. And who is doing these various calculations all at once? Yes, that should be about all of us, right? So thankfully, the two people who are joining me today have dedicated their lives to trying to solve for these caregiving crises. I think it's okay to call it a crisis here in Massachusetts. Both Donna and Lauren have been working diligently across spheres of their various careers to take on these issues. And I'm so glad to have this conversation here to talk about affordability and parenting and caregiving across a spectrum of needs. But first off, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your careers and your path into your careers. Why don't you just, if you could, just introduce yourselves quickly and tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the caregiving space.
Hello, everyone. There's a few people from Cure.com. I see you in the audience, and for Babson, it is so good to see you and to be in conversation with all of you. On caregiving, I was really struck listening to Andrea's story. Because it just reminded me that, wow, I didn't think about what my mom went through. Growing up in a single-parent household, we moved here for a better education when my parents divorced, when I was just one. And it was all about education, and it was about getting through K through 12 education. So fast forward, and would love to have the conversation about college because there was no money to pay for college. But over the course of my career, finally, sort of at my dream job. I've worked my way through school, really focused at a mission-driven company, and just a spoiler alert, with my mother's backstory, she taught me never to get married. It's a raw deal for women, and never to have children. And so, fast forward, something happened along the way where not only did I end up married, my first child was my 5-year project. I desperately wanted this child. And so as I went on leave, I was on bed rest for a very long time. I had 3 males come and cover my job while I was gone at this company. One male said smartly, the job's too much, I can't do it, I need help. And they're like, of course you do. They got him 2 other men. And so I thought I was gonna go back to that job. I had a conversation where they came and someone came and brought me a chair, for the baby to nurse and said, hey, what are you thinking when you're gonna do when you come back? And I was like, I'm gonna take over one of my teams. And they're like, you can't really do that now because you're a mom. You can't work around the clock anymore. And don't worry, because your good friend, who we also moved out of technology, we think you guys could form this team together, and it's gonna be amazing. And so, of course, I was furious. I gave her a call, and we made this pact that we were going to try this because she also had a care crisis, that we were gonna try this together, and if it didn't work, we could both leave. So as I was due to come back, where I had my daycare plans laid out, at 11 weeks, my child had a seizure-like episode, and daycare was no longer an option. As we realized that it was going to be a period where my child needed constant monitoring, that we were gonna have to make some changes. And so my husband left his job. He was a therapist. He saw clients at night so he could care for our child during the day. I went back to that mission-driven startup, and we handed the child off, in between, and maybe had some help from families. So fast forward, while being at that tech company, we were tracking everything about families to help them save money for college. I knew about your groceries, your gas, your mortgage, your travel plans. We had all of this data and information. And all of those future co-founders of CARE, we were doing things like putting ads in the library, the newspaper, bulletin boards, trying to figure out this care. I had a ton of team members, when their performance went down and you pulled them aside, they said, you know what, I've actually been going home on the weekends, something's going wrong with my parents. And you don't really talk about what's going on with your parents. So as all of this sort of came to a head, and that company was acquired, and thinking about what to do next, it was someone's there has to be a solution for this. And that was really the both of care.com. And we learned so much along the way on that journey.
Lauren, you were in a... It's an incredible one. Lauren, you were in a similar spot where you and your co-founder were both pregnant and both sort of searching for a solution. You thought you were going to open a school. You did something very different. Talk a little bit about Neighborhood Villages.
So Neighborhood Villages, I co-founded with Sarah Muncie, who is also here today, as our other members of the Neighborhood Villages team. We co-founded Neighborhood Villages in 2017 as, for me, I had just given birth to my first daughter. Well, actually, we say we co-founded Neighborhood Villages in 2016 because we became friends when I was pregnant with my first child. Sarah was pregnant with her second daughter, and we gave birth right around the same time in late December. We are extremely privileged to have had paid maternity leave, but if you have had a baby in late December, that leave can be very grim. You are in January, February, and March at home with your little baby. And fortunately, Sarah and I became great friends through that bonding experience as moms and looking at each other and saying, we are two white women in privileged positions. If it is so hard for us to figure out how to make this work, what are we doing? What are we asking of people in this country, in Massachusetts? How are we asking them to do the mom math of figure out on my salary, how am I going back to work if childcare is, for some people, more than 50% of their salary. You mentioned the $25,000-ish for an infant. The average childcare cost that families in Massachusetts are paying right now is closer to $40,000 a year, because many who have an infant in childcare often have a toddler. And it might be that second child where you finally say, I can't do it anymore, I have to leave the workforce. So Sarah and I sort of sat there looking at each other, loved seeing the mayor up here breastfeeding. It takes me back to us sort of sitting on each other's couches doing that and saying, this can't stand, what's the contribution that we can make? And we looked at our backgrounds. I came from healthcare policy. I did a lot of work here in Massachusetts, also in Washington, D.C., on implementation of the Massachusetts Healthcare Reform Initiative and implementation on the Affordable Care Act. I am a super nerd. Anybody who wants to talk about healthcare policy or childcare policy, meet me in the back after this. And Sarah had a career in K-12 operations and administration, running schools, understanding the actual operations of how schools work, how they connect to districts, how do they connect to each other. And we looked at each other and said, you know, we see a problem that resembles our healthcare reform initiative. We have a private product that everybody needs, but it's too expensive to afford. And part of that reason is because it is so expensive to provide, and it should be expensive to provide. We want our teachers to be paid the wages that they deserve. We want our classrooms to be safe, to be high quality, to be everything that we would want to be offering our child if we were home with that baby in our arms. And so what do? How do we look at this from a policy lens that we make it affordable at the same time that we make it high quality? It's what we did with the Affordable Care Act. Not perfect, but we're getting there. How do we get people to afford the care that they need to take care of their health and well-being? And at the same time, how do we use public investment to create a system that works? One that is accessible for families, guaranteed for families, one that invests in its teachers and its workforce so that our teachers are not just paid what they're due, but they're invested in as professionals. They are not volunteers, they are not babysitters, they are educators. Let's treat them like that. And Sarah said, hey, I know how to do that because we do it by constitutional right for children 5 and older. We don't have constitutional rights to education for very young children, so we make do with what we have, but we know how to do it. We know how to run education systems. She knows how to run education systems. So the two of us came together and said, if we take my kind of wonky brain and we take your intelligence in how to create education systems could our contribution be helping to create a vision for childcare systems change in Massachusetts? And you mentioned we thought we'd start a school. We did. We thought, hey, if we make the perfect space, we can show everybody how it can be done. And then we spent, the better part of 2 years driving around in Sarah's minivan, realizing nobody needs us to build a school. We have incredible childcare programs here in Massachusetts. Lauren Cook, the director of Ellis Early Learning, is here. I'm sure there are other. I would actually love if anybody is. Well, maybe we can just give a round of applause to caregivers generally, but certainly if you are an early educator or provider in this room, because you are doing such important work. So we said, you know what, nobody needs us to create another school. What our contribution can be is creating that infrastructure around our early education providers, working at the policy level to fight for the public funding that this system needs. We are not going to be able, unfortunately, mom math will not be able to solve for the fact that if you want it to be affordable and you want to increase the quality, those two things are in tension unless we bring in public funds to offset the cost of high quality and say it's not just on parents to figure out how to pay for it anymore at upwards of $40,000 a year, but we are going to bring in public funds to say it's going to be the collective responsibility to ensure that our children are getting the education that they deserve and that families have the childcare options that they need in order to go to work. So that takes government. That takes all of us. That takes fighting at the policy level, both for public investment and for policy change. And at the same time, we are going to be investing through direct service programs directly into the early education and care system as we have it today. Again, not wanting to be overly political, it's like we can't wait for government, guys. We got to roll up our hands and start the work now. And so Neighborhood Villages, from the beginning, said we're going to take a direct service approach combined with policy work in order to run directly at the early education and care crisis that we have nationally. We are doing a much better job in Massachusetts over the last couple of years, but it is still here, it is still present, and we still have a lot of work that we need to do today. So no, we did not build a school. We pivoted and said, how can we support the schools that we already have? How can we fight for the investment that will make sure that we can raise wages, that we can build additional childcare supply, and do it in a way that centers the child and centers the family so that we're ensuring that these children have the education they deserve and that the families have childcare options that are guaranteed and accessible to them.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about infrastructure, and I think you both went into the space of thinking about how to change the caregiving system with maybe one plan in mind, and then soon learned that no, there's just not one element to this. There's actually a whole rank and file of other elements that you need to incorporate in. Talk with me a little bit about building some of these wraparound services, addressing some of the other needs in the caregiving space, and how some of your proudest accomplishments along those lines. Because I do think, once you get into the space, you realize just how many needs there are.
Sure. So when we talk about infrastructure and wraparound services in early education, it's because we don't really have infrastructure. We have around 8,000 early education and care providers, private enterprise. They're child care centers, they're family child care homes. We do have an increasing presence of pre-K or pre-K inclusive of preschool through our district schools. But when we're talking largely about childcare, we are talking about private businesses. There is sort of regional support in terms of licensing, in terms of some levels of professional development, continuing education, et cetera. But there's nothing akin to say how elementary schools connect to each other or connect to a district or connect to a greater infrastructure. Childcare is sort of operating on islands. It's fractured. And so as Neighborhood Villages has thought about its work is really how do we model what a system would be? Take a sector and turn it into a system, one that has backbone infrastructure. And so how we do that is through partnership with early education and care providers, Again, we don't operate any schools. What we do is bring them into community together and say, what's missing? What's a challenge? Where do you see opportunity? And how can we help build that infrastructure and connectivity across you and with the state? We talk about our model as innovating at a hyper-local level. We say we innovate often with philanthropy to figure out, okay, what's missing? I'm gonna give a very specific example. Because again, people are like, infrastructure, what do you mean? COVID happens. Everything shuts down, except for childcare. Childcare stayed open through March, through April, because many programs stood up emergency systems. So even if childcare kind of closed, most reopened almost immediately in order to serve the families of our frontline workers, our healthcare providers, et cetera. And then by June, July, the country was ready for other people to go back to work, so they looked at childcare and said, go back to work, ladies, because it is a workforce of women, and largely Black and brown women and immigrant women. With no real coordinated access to PPE, with no real coordinated access to COVID testing, and just sort of wished everybody good luck. And what we realized was that wasn't gonna work. We needed a systematized infrastructure to wrap around our early education and care system if we were expecting them to open so that others could go back to work. We said to the state, we need COVID testing. We need teachers to be able to figure out, am I sick? Are you sick? Can you come to work? Because if we can't, we have to assume anybody who sneezes has COVID for 2 weeks, and we can't open the classroom, and if there's no classroom, you don't have childcare and you can't go to work. And the state said we can't do that. We don't have any administrative infrastructure. We don't even have real relationships with a lot of these providers. How am I supposed to get weekly COVID tests out to 8,000 small businesses across the state of Massachusetts? And we said, well, if you won't figure it out, we'll figure it out. So we started with a small COVID testing pilot of about 8 schools or so, about 700 adults. And with 18 months, we had a contract with the state, and we were testing 125,000 children, caregivers, and adults weekly, because we showed what infrastructure looks like. We are doing that, presently today around workforce development. Again, just a kind of hyper-specific example. We run the largest registered apprenticeship for early educators in Massachusetts. Again, this goes back to relatively recent history. I think about 18 months, 2 years ago, with a small hyper-local pilot, we were able to say, we think registered apprenticeship is a way to help build this workforce. And people said, no, it's not. It's for other industries. I said, well, if you'll give us a chance, could we figure out how to do it? And we did, and now we have cohorts of apprentices going through, not just to enter the field, but to advance their careers. It is not only, I think, an investment at a systems level, at an infrastructure level in our early education and care workforce, but it is also the ability to offer people career advancement and to improve teacher retention. So again, going back, if we want a system that's high quality, that starts with our teachers, investment in teachers, so investment in workforce development opportunities at a systems level that doesn't just recruit talent, it keeps it, and it allows it opportunity to thrive.
That's great. Thank you.
I was thinking about, was there like one thing to be most proud of? I think it was sort of pulling back. I love that, like, at one point, everyone's hand should have been up. There was the realization that the person who is making all the decisions about caregiving from our children, our pets, our parents, tutoring, lessons, tends to be the chief household officer, many of us in this room, and those services were highly fragmented. And so as I think of what was really proud of, it was the recognition of how do we bring all this together under one umbrella, and there were a number of things that we realized along the way. Our original hypothesis looking at our own lives, it was probably, you described yourself as like, hey, we're these 2 women, we're privileged. We thought, you know what? We are one of the most expensive places to live in the country. The people who were going to use our services are going to be these affluent women. We had our whole, persona. She does yoga. She goes to Starbucks. She does all of these things. She makes X number of dollars. And then when we actually looked at the data and our members across the country, some of these households were making $50,000. They were not affluent. It was the realization that if you were looking for a job, you needed some type of care. If you had a job, you needed some type of care, that everyone needed some type of caregiving, and we all had very different situations. As we dug into this data, we realized that many of the protections that we all want and enjoy in the workplace that caregivers did not have. This is why they don't want to be in the field. This is why it wasn't changing. In some parts of this country still, if you're a senior care worker and you're working full time, you're making about $13,000 a year. And you were doing some of the most difficult work there could be. And so on the caregiver side of the house, it was this push on how do you professionalize, how do you work with other agencies, and realize there was a whole world of people doing amazing work. We could just shine a spotlight on their work and bring them together. You had places like the Childcare of America that was training family caregivers and putting systems in place. You had the Domestic Workers Alliance that was pushing for legislation state by state to make sure that all those workers at time, if they were coming to your home, it was someone's workplace and they deserved things like paid leave and time off when they were sick. It was the realization on thinking about sort of the safety of these systems, that there was no sort of national standardized check of any sort to ensure, as sometimes in some states it was more difficult to open a nail salon than a daycare. And so really pushing behind the scenes for that legislation, that was like one side of it, and then arming parents with information about honestly what you can expect to pay for care so you could start planning. And then we've talked about policy in the government, and that we have, we can use our voice and advocate, but I'm at a business school. Business has a huge role to play, and the realization that we could expect more from employers. If we're really bringing our whole selves to the workforce, it meant that we were also bringing our real lives to the workforce, and we had needs beyond some of those basic benefits, and starting to shine a spotlight on employers who really got that. I know we've had this conversation about how expensive it is for care. My kids are now 16, just turned 16, and my son is 22. I can, for anyone who has older kids, the costs just keep going up. Like, it doesn't disappear. It ebbs and flows. And so how do we work with policymakers who care deeply about that? Everything from childcare tax credits to doing innovative things like giving employers deductions if they'll match your 529 account. A 529 account used to be something 20 years ago where you could put money in to save for college. And now in 8 states in this country, because of the legislation that's changed, those same dollars that you put aside can be used for things like childcare. And if you don't use those funds, or your kid decides not to go to college, it can be rolled over into a savings plans for them. There's some great employers who we'll work with now to realize that all of us who are afraid of how am I going to pay for college, or we're still paying off our own school loans, have innovative programs that will help pay for your school loans, integrative programs that will do tuition assistance. And so it's a whole community coming together. I love that you mentioned COVID, because prior to COVID, there was a caregiving crisis. We knew there was a caregiving crisis, but suddenly during the pandemic, when everybody was trapped in the house together, it was like, we really do have a caregiving crisis, and we cannot let people forget. Like, what's a covert keeper? It's all of us coming together to say that crisis is real, and it still exists, and there are a number of supports that we continue to need.
Thank you. I always talk about how the caregiving crisis really came into came into the focus in part because literally my children were like pulling my hair and climbing on my lap while I was on Zoom screens. So it was like impossible for my coworkers to not recognize that I was a caregiver and that I had children at home. And it really it changed the narrative. And I think all of the things that you both have been talking about in terms of the way we are now approaching the childcare crisis 5 years out, I think it's heartening to hear. And I think there's also a lot of promise happening, and a lot of this is happening on the state level. Lauren, you talk about wanting to do for childcare reform what Massachusetts did for healthcare reform. Talk with me a little bit about Governor Maura Healey's latest budget, what kind of early education allocations could mean for working parents now, and what you hope we'll see come out of that.
Sure. So, there's amongst a lot going on in this country and the world these days. We have positive things to be excited about here in Massachusetts. Governor Healey's budget that she put out earlier this year holds steady the investment that the Commonwealth has made in early education and care over the last couple years. It still has a ways to go, but given, again, the environment that we are in, we are thrilled to see the Healey-Driscoll administration put a stake in the ground that they will continue to prioritize early education as we go forward into this fiscal year. So there's about $1.5 billion in the budget for early education. It's not going to be enough, right, to make it affordable for everybody while paying teachers what they deserve to be paid. However, when you compare it to where we were pre-COVID, the budget has doubled, more so. We used to be at about $700 million for early education, and so we have seen significant progress as we fight for the public investment that we know this sector deserves. I think some of the priorities that we really need to pay attention to in this year's budget are around funding for our childcare financial assistance caseload. The way that pre-COVID childcare has traditionally been publicly funded is really through a welfare model. A family is of a certain income, they are eligible for a childcare benefit, they receive that benefit, and that's really right how their childcare tuition is subsidized by government. Critically important. With COVID came a lot more federal funding for childcare, and it came in a new way. It came in a way in which providers could directly receive public funds through a grants-based program. So again, think about K-12. While schools are receiving at some level funding based on enrollment, they are really being funded at a foundational level in recognition that whether you have a classroom at full capacity or a classroom at 87% capacity, you still need those same teachers, you still need to pay for the facilities costs, you still need to keep the lights on. So these direct-to-provider grants have really, for the first time, recognized that we need to keep our child care providers open and functioning and paying their teachers in a way that is a predictable business model. So in the budget, we want to preserve those funds for child care financial assistance, those benefits that attach to the family, enable lower income families to access care, and we really need to preserve the line item that supports these direct-to-provider operations grants. You'll often see them referred to as Commonwealth Cares for Children, or C3 grants. Again, they began during the pandemic as federal funds, and the Commonwealth is one, if not the only, of very few states who have kept these grants and now fund them with 100% state dollars. So really, again, things to be excited about in terms of progress moving forward in Massachusetts. So I'd say pay attention to those two things. And one other I'll mention, and I'll be brief, is there's a line item in early education to support access to mental health. This is a crisis in this sector as much as it is a crisis with our elementary, adolescent-aged children. It looks different in early childhood. We're not talking about babies needing therapy on couches, right? We're talking about children who are exhibiting the behaviors of trauma, of the trauma that their parents, right, may be experiencing. So when we look at what does mental health support in early education look like, we refer to it as early relational health. It's how are we wrapping around teachers, how are we wrapping around parents so that they can invest in the nurturing relationships with children that build healthy development, that help put those little brains together. So a line item around bringing more mental health, behavioral health, early relational health supports into early education is really critical in this moment too.
Thank you so much to you both. Oh,
Can I build on that? Not at the
unfortunately,
state
we're
level?
hitting
at
our
the local
time.
level.
I know we could keep talking for like another half hour or more, but I'm being rude, but not letting the next group of people come up. So I would thank you both for so much of your work in this space and for all the work you're doing to help support caregivers, families in Massachusetts. Next up, you'll hear from Dr. Heather Hirsch and my colleague, Kara Baskin, but I just wanted to hand it back to Saskia very quickly to say thank you, and thank you both.